Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zack Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington, where it's day 2 of autumn.
You're in there. Spring has sprung here. It's warming up, but it's we're getting a little bit of fog as well, which does tend to happen around this part of the world. Makes for interesting mornings at the airport sometimes. But yeah, it's definitely starting to warm up, which is quite nice too. And we go to daylight savings tomorrow as we're recording this, so we'll have some long light evenings as well.
Oh, that's exciting. That's always a nice moment. We got hit by wildfire smoke again this past week, but which was not good. But it's gone away, so that's good. Yeah. It was brief. Yeah.
The other thing that's not good is the world outlook according to the United Nations, which is probably no big surprise, but I think a bit of surprise is just how explicit the statements were at the opening of that meeting in New York this week. But I suspect, on reflection of that, probably is what is needed to get some of those big issues like climate change really in people's faces and just keep it right up there on the top of the agenda.
Yeah. It needs to be top of mind for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, we got some really good stories this week, but let's have a quick shout out to supporters of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything we do at the Accelerator, including Passive House Podcast, comes thanks to generous support from sponsors. So a big thank you to our founding sponsors: 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minitaire All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwool North America, StoCorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors and Proseco. And thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Great. Now, can I start with a little story that I found this week?
Absolutely. Please do.
So lots of really cool small stories. I mean, there's a theme of some of the large stories, which I think we're going to see for a while, like the Winthrop Center, just keep appearing. But I quite like these little or smaller projects. This one's actually a reasonable size. In the planning stages, and I'll just read from the top of the article. This is from it's called Blenheim Estate Homes in Britain, and it's said to be potentially Britain's biggest rural passive house community. Blenheim Estate Homes is awaiting planning permission to build what is believed to be the largest rural development of passive house standard homes in the UK. It's a community in Woodstock, Oxfordshire, and it will include in the region of 180 net zero living homes that require little heating or cooling. So they're looking at around 180 homes built to the passive house standards, and doing a bunch of other really cool stuff, including ensuring good biodiversity on the site, lots of open green spaces, and a proportion of the homes will aim to be at the affordable end as well. So some really good stuff there, and I really like these. There's a couple of things that I like about these stories. One, that they're popping up with a focus and an explicit focus on passive house, but also that this story is not from a building magazine or a construction website. It's just a local little news item from a community website by the looks of it, community news, and it's putting Passive House right there on the map. So really cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. My favorite this week was an article in Condé Nast Condé Nast Traveler magazine. So there's a list that the title of this article is 11 Sustainable Hotels that are setting a standard in hospitality. So one of those hotels is Hotel Marcel, which is the Passive House retrofit of a brutalist monolith by Bauhaus master Marcel Breuer. So this is in Connecticut, 2 miles from Yale. I think that we've probably spoken about this project on the podcast a little bit, at least in passing. It's been around for, I think, a couple of years, but it's cool to see that it's, making this list. And it is now it's a 165 room hotel. It's under the Tapestry Collection by Hilton. And according to this, it's on track to qualify as USA's first net zero hotel by May 2023. So Passive House and net zero, and I'm looking forward to staying there sometime.
It's kind of a big concrete box that's floating on. It is what looks like a bunch of glass.
Yeah, it's pretty. It's pretty intense. I think people who live in on the East Coast know this building because it's right off the freeway. Yeah, and so they've seen, it really stands out. Yeah. I think it used to be called the Pirelli building, if I'm not mistaken, for the Pirelli tires. It was the headquarters for a while. I think it's had a couple of lives, but now it's reborn as a Passive House hotel, which is cool.
And similar as well, that it's just Passive House just popping up there in something that's not specifically about Passive House, not even about buildings particularly. It's a travel website, but really cool to just see Passive House popping up there in common articles, common day language.
Yeah, definitely. I think this project is not probably what people have in mind when they think of going to an eco hotel or something, right? With a bunch of green everywhere, and that's this is. Well, I think a brutalist building.
Brutalist is a very apt description for this, which we can have a whole nother session on that. Doesn't mean it's ugly. Brutalist has definitely its own type of beauty. All right. Good stuff. Good stuff going on out there. Now let's jump into this week's interview. I had a chat with a friend of mine, Glenn Murdoch. I've known Glenn for quite a while, must be over a decade now. He, as he explains in the interview, is one of the people responsible really for getting Passive House, certainly the Passive House Institute, going in New Zealand. He's been involved in that scene for quite some time. He is an architectural designer, and he's also tried a number of things, including some prefabrication and thinking about ways to deliver Passive House to a fledgling market. And I really like that sort of entrepreneurial spirit that he has. It hasn't always been smooth sailing, but it's great to see him still at it, and now doing quite well and being in demand and busy like a lot of people are in this space. But it's not a guarantee. Just because the market's good for construction doesn't necessarily guarantee being busy as a Passive House designer. But Glenn certainly is at the moment. So here he is, Glenn Murdoch, who is now based down in Christchurch. Well, thank you, Glenn, for joining us on Passive House Podcast. Great to have you here. You're coming to us from Christchurch. How are things down there?
It's great. Spring's coming. The weather's improving after a very wet winter. It's nice.
You're from Christchurch originally?
No, I've moved around a lot over the years. So when I first started with Passive House, I was living in Wanaka at the time. This is prior to the Christchurch earthquakes, which were back in 2011. So I moved to Christchurch in 2012 after the earthquakes.
And what were you doing down in Wanaka?
the same thing, architecture and trying to put passive houses on the ground down there.
Yeah. Describe Wanaka for people who don't know where it is and what it is.
Yeah, sure. So Wanaka is a small alpine town in the southern part of the South Island of New Zealand, in the mountains beside the lake. It's very, very beautiful. Since we left, it's grown dramatically in terms of population, and I guess it's becoming a little less pleasant. But the situation is still beautiful with snow-covered mountains and beautiful blue lakes around.
It's very Lord of the Rings, Hobbit kind of beautiful landscapes. And Wanaka itself, always sort of a smaller sibling to Queenstown, which a lot of
that's right. It's just over the hill from Queenstown, but you did right. It's still quite a touristy town, but not on the same sort of scale as Queenstown.
Yeah, soon to be just out of Wanaka, I think soon to be home to one of the first non-residential passive houses in New Zealand, with the community hall in
correct. That's
Luggett.
Right. That Jessica's been working on in Luggett. That's right. Yeah. So that was quite exciting to see. That was the local government stepping up and demanding passive house. So that's I guess quite a move towards doing better public buildings as well in New Zealand.
What was your motivation for wanting to put passive houses on the ground in Wanaka?
Wanaka just happened to be where I was living at the time, and since I started back in architecture back in the early 2000s, I'd been trying to figure out ways to improve what I was doing. And I had this idea that I was doing okay, but I was looking for a way of demonstrating to myself and to my clients that I was doing a decent job. And this is, you might remember, Matthew, back in the mid-2000s, there was the home energy rating scheme came out of the government, and there was a lot of fanfare around that, and I got quite heavily involved in that. And what I learned quite a lot through that process around how buildings work in terms of their thermal performance. And what I realised is that what was happening then was flawed and didn't work. So then I started looking around for what does work, and through another colleague stumbled across Passive House, and it was just kind of all came together serendipitously at the same time. I was looking for it. It was becoming available in terms of the training in New Zealand at the same time. So in 2010, I did my training. So I was one of the first people to be trained in New Zealand.
You were also instrumental in setting up Passive House Institute, weren't you?
Yeah, correct. So I was one of the founding members of the Passive House Institute. So that was back in 2010 or 11, something around there. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I'm one of the founding members of that, and that's gone ahead in leaps and bounds since then.
Given that at that time, because I remember the launch of Passive House Institute, and it was a small group of very passionate people with probably not a lot of money, up against what you described previously as the home energy rating scheme, which was pretty heavily invested in, and a fairly robust methodology on a software platform, kind of imported from Australia. Why do we not have hers, but we now have over 50 passive houses in New Zealand?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's just after hers was launched, there was a change of government, and the new relatively right-leaning government that came in wasn't so keen on increasing, in inverted commas, increasing the cost of building, and they ditched it. They threw it in the bin basically on day one of their tenure, and it was scrapped. And then it wasn't very long after that Passive House kind of came onto the scene and filled the gap, I guess, for want of a better word.
Yeah. And what about the usability? Because I remember doing that HERS training as well, and I got really excited about it initially because I thought, this is great. For the first time, we'd actually be able to have a reasonable prediction of performance. But I quickly found out that it took a long time to put in all the information required, all the geometry, measuring all the windows and where the windows were. Took a huge amount of measurement and then time to enter all that. But I guess that's the same for Passive House as well, right? When you're doing PHPP.
Yeah, I think so. But I think the tool, you're right, the tool then was pretty clunky. But once you got your head around it, you could speed up pretty quickly. And you did right. Passive House is the same. The first time you use Passive House, it's pretty slow and confusing. But once you learn it and understand it, then you can get pretty quick.
Yeah, yeah. So where to from there? What do you do? Well, what are you doing now?
Yeah, so now I live in Christchurch, a small architecture firm. I've got just one employee, and we do our best to put passive houses on the ground. But what I've learned over the years is that passive house, I see it as a great design tool. In terms of the final outcome, I've sort of tempered my enthusiasm somewhat in that I'm not committed to putting certified passive houses on the ground. I'm committed to putting very good buildings on the ground, but they don't have to be certified to be good buildings. And if people want to certify them, and I encourage people to certify them, then that's great. But what I'm seeing is that it's a small proportion of our clients are keen to go that final extra mile and certify them. And I think that's okay.
Do you always use PHPP?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a great, and not only for the understanding the performance of the building, it's also a design tool. So right from early on in the design process, we're modelling the building to understand its performance, and then using it as a way of checking design tweaks and design permutations to figure out what the best solution is going to be.
I think that's a really important point, and I try and encourage that with even with Homestar as well, to not just treat it as a certification to get an award at the end, but to use to inform the decision making through the design process.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're seeing more and more, I mean, passive houses and high performance houses in a winter situation, they're super easy to keep warm. That's super easy.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing more and more is that keeping them cool in summer is really challenging. And even in a relatively mild climate like Christchurch, it's still challenging to keep them cool in summer. So more and more, we're using it as a design tool around shading and glazing orientation and size to mitigate against overheating.
And with respect to the New Zealand Building Code, why is that important?
Well, the New Zealand Building Code doesn't care about overheating. It cares a little bit about underheating, but it's got an extraordinarily poor methodology of addressing that. And there's some steps in the right direction there, but it's very poor. But I mean, if you talk to people that live in these houses, they're quite clear that it's just as uncomfortable to be too hot for all summer than too cold all winter.
Yeah.
And it's much easier to warm a building up artificially than to cool it down.
Mm-hmm.
So stopping it overheating, I think, is one of the big challenges as designers we've got, especially as we start to get warmer. And that's another great thing about PHPP. I can artificially play with the climate data just to run scenario-based things about what might happen in 30 years' time. If it's a degree warmer, for example, what does that look like for this building in 30 years?
Do you do that manually, or I thought it was Jason Quinn starting to provide some climate files that are predictions of where things are going? Yeah,
I think he is, yes. But I've just for quite some time now just been doing it manually. I just unlock the sheet and modify the data.
And just to amp up the what do you do? Increase the temperature or increase the duration of warmer temperatures?
Or both. So just over the summer period, just ramp up the temperatures just slightly, just by 1 degree. And it's interesting to see what such a small increase in temperature does to the performance of the building. It's a dramatic impact.
So do you find that that 10% allowance of exceedance of 25 degrees internally, does that go up substantially?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'd argue that 10% is way too high to start with. We aim for to maximum of 2% is our goal. 10% is way too high. You're going to be uncomfortably hot all summer if you've got it at 10%.
So how do you achieve that?
Like, in the first instance, it's through orientation of glazing and doing your best to minimise the west-facing glazing especially. And then sometimes that's challenging. Christchurch is a hilly city, and often sites are facing west, and you need to put glazing on the west, so that's challenging. And then second strategy is shading devices, whether that's overhanging eaves to the north or vertical sliding screens or whatever it might be on the east and west facades.
Somebody made that point to me recently. Well, it's taken me a while to get my head around that, because I've always thought of shading being above the window, but that makes a lot of sense when you actually look at the path of the sun, which you can do now pretty accurately for any location. That on the aspect of the building that faces the equator, shading above the window is more important, but on those east and west aspects, often it's side shading.
Yeah, correct. That's right.
That can make the most, because that makes sense, right? In the evening, that's the angle of the sun is going to be off to the side.
Yeah, that's right. It's coming in underneath that horizontal overhang that you might have above the window. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you've also been involved in you've explored options for prefabrication.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So some years ago now, we had this idea that we could improve the efficiency of building high performance buildings. So we set up an offsite fabrication factory here in Christchurch, doing just timber frame structures, pretty simple wall, floor, and roof panels. Nothing special, and tried to get the building industry and the design industry here in Christchurch to pick that up. But we really struggled with that, and we had to shut it down in the end just because we couldn't sell them. And I still don't get why that isn't more popular in New Zealand. If you look at just to our neighbours to Australia, it's a lot more popular over there. You don't have to go very far to see it working really well. But I think there's the industry here is deeply embedded in its historical ways of doing things, and they seemed just to be nervous about something new, even though it wasn't very new and exciting in my mind.
Yeah. And there's a cost. I guess there's an assumption that there's going to be a massive decrease in cost if you're providing some off-site construction, but there also is a bit of misconception there that you're providing something of much higher performance. So you're not really comparing apples and apples if you're comparing that to a standard code compliant construction.
Yeah, what we found is that it was cost neutral. So things were a lot faster, obviously, in the factory, but there's a bunch of overheads to pay for in the factory. But the time savings were offset by that. So we found it to be cost neutral compared to building on site, but significantly faster, which is where there was potential if the builder was smart to make some savings on site.
Yeah.
By speeding the process up.
Where do you lie now in terms of design? Do you still try and incorporate some prefabrication, or do you have a preferred method of construction?
Yeah, so definitely lightweight timber frame. It's a no-brainer, I think. In New Zealand, we've got lots of timber here, even though a lot of it goes overseas, which is a challenge. But we've got a lot of timber. The entire industry is built around doing lightweight timber frame building. So everyone knows what they're doing. They've got the tools in their van. They don't need to learn any new techniques to build a passive house out of timber.
Yeah.
Everything's designed for lightweight timber frame. It's a relatively low carbon footprint method of building compared to some other options out there. So that's why I'm a fan. It's also very versatile.
Right. And so you're talking about like normal timber framing. Do you make the walls a bit thicker? Do you change anything from standard construction?
Yeah, we're doing a few different things. And again, it's not rocket science. So the timber frame might be a little bit thicker. Depends on the design and the climate that we're putting it in. If we're further up north in Auckland, we might not need to go much thicker at all.
Yeah.
Down here in Christchurch, we're typically using 140. So how many inches are there? 8-inch frames. Is it
140 millimeters.
6-inch frames.
Yeah.
And then we're putting some moisture control on the inside, and then a timber frame surface cavity. But I guess the big difference we're doing is being careful about our primary structural framing, and so not putting nogs or dwangs in it, and just using external ply sheathing to achieve what the dwangs would normally be doing. So that's obviously improving the framing proportion and dramatically improving the performance of the wall frame.
Are there challenges to doing that on the ground, like when you with consenting or with building sub-trades? Any challenges that you face when actually getting these designs built?
Not with consenting. It's a straight out of the book option in terms of the structure of the building. You need to pay a little bit more attention to, for example, fixings for external claddings. You need to pay attention to that if you haven't got the dwangs. But again, the simple
because that becomes your bracing.
No, more that I need to have often quite frequent horizontal members to fix claddings to. So I just need to put on a structural grained cavity batten on the outside of the frame.
Right.
To put, for example, vertical weatherboards onto.
So
the consenting is easy. Getting the frame and truss plants to remember to not put the dwangs in is more of a problem. So the builder needs to be on the ball there. I've always got this theory that frame and truss plants don't build walls. They're in the business of selling timber. That's what they do. That's why all those extra studs are there. They're selling timber. So the builder needs to pay attention to what's going on there to make sure the dwangs don't go in the frame and truss plant.
Right. And what about those extra membranes that you mentioned? Because none of those, most buildings will have a form of wrap on the outside, but it's not necessarily doing what it needs to be doing very well. I assume that you're upgrading to something of a higher weather tightness membrane on the outside, but then also adding an air tightness or moisture control on the inside. So is that an extra layer that either the client or the builder might not have seen before?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you're right. We're upgrading the external wrap to a better performance one. A lot of the ones that are on the market here in New Zealand the performance of them is pretty poor. So we're using a Pro Climber wrap on the outside, which does the job really well. And then on the inside, we're using Intello for moisture control and air tightness. And you're right. A lot of clients haven't seen that, but a lot of our clients come to us with some level of understanding around high performance houses. They're not coming to us and we're convincing them to upgrade from a code minimum house. They're coming to us because of what we do. So it's not a hard job to talk to them about this stuff. And the same with the builders. We've got a pool of builders that we work with who understand this stuff. So we don't have to teach them every time.
Yeah. I always like to find out from designers about how their marketing and how they get to do passive house projects. You've been around now, so you sort of established a bit of a name for yourself. Was that a tricky journey? And like you say, do most of your people now come because they know what you do?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so like you say, I've been doing it for quite a long time now, but it's been a long, hard road. It's trying to be the point of the spear, if you like, when there weren't many people wanting to buy it. So there was a lot of lean years there where there wasn't a lot of work going on. But what I've seen, just even I guess in the last 5 years, a lot more awareness about how crappy our buildings are in New Zealand, the new buildings that are being built to the building code minimum, and a lot more awareness about how easy it is to upgrade, and passive houses becoming part, I think, more and more part of the common language of Kiwis. So it's pretty rare now to say to someone, I do passive houses, and they go, I don't know what that is.
Right. Do you turn clients away?
Sometimes, yeah. At the moment, we're very busy. So I wouldn't probably turn people away, but we say you'll have to be patient.
But do you sometimes turn them away because they're not the right fit, or they're just not interested in doing what you want to provide?
Yes. I think there's a line in the sand, where we won't do code minimum houses. At least the challenging part there is when you're doing alterations. Sometimes it's very difficult there to integrate high performance principles into an alteration, but we do our best. And sometimes I think that's all we can do.
Do you still use PHPP when you're doing a major renovation?
No, not so much on an alteration project, because I think there's limited. Often we find, especially on a small alteration, there's limited scope for what you can actually do.
Yeah. I mean, that whole area is so challenging, I think, and still yet to be figured out for a lot of New Zealand, the best way to do deep retrofits, not just from a technical point of view, but also from a financial point of view.
Absolutely. I agree. And I think we've talked about this in the past. I think technically it's not super difficult, but economically it's very difficult to make it stack up for the type of buildings we've got.
Yeah, so much better to do it right the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. But we've got these, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of old buildings that people are living in that we need to do something with, and I don't know what the answer is there.
Yeah. So it's great that you're really busy now. Where to? You're just a small firm. What are the plans? What would you like to see happen in the next, say, 5 years?
Yeah. So I'm getting more and more interested in doing more commercial work. So I'm just trying to figure out how to get some more commercial work around town and try and start to put some better buildings on the ground there. And one of the interesting things that's happening there is with the new energy efficiency requirements of the building code, where the commercial requirements have gone up. So, for example, in Christchurch, we won't be able to see single glazed aluminium framed shop fronts anymore. So that's
shocking.
So some things
imagine
like
that.
Oh no! Some things like that are really interesting. So that's one of my things I'm trying to work on, is getting some more commercial work. But also, I'm working on trying to put together some people to work with to do some developments. So perhaps some townhouse or small dwelling developments.
Yep.
As rental properties. So it's becoming more and more clear that in New Zealand there's a large proportion of the population will never be able to own a house because it's becoming so unaffordable. But I don't see that a lifetime of renting a house can't confer the benefits of home ownership. So I've got this idea about a rental model whereby people can have, secure long-term housing that's very good quality, where they can increase their wealth and financial security as they rent a good quality house. So that's I'm starting to work on that, trying to find some people to partner with on that.
Yeah, which is not completely new or it's a great idea.
Correct.
But it's not like none of this stuff is reinventing the wheel, right? I mean, the models of long-term tenure have existed in Europe and other places for a long
decades
time.
and decades and decades. That's exactly right. I'm not inventing anything here. I'm just trying to bring it to New Zealand.
Yeah, but I think you're right. There's so much wound up in the current culture of New Zealand, probably Australia as well, as that need to be on the property ladder. And
even that's an interesting word. Even using the word ladder straight away.
It implies that you have to get on to move up.
Exactly. And it's not okay to stay at the bottom.
Yeah. And that is the only real viable way of generating wealth, like you say.
Correct.
So there's always conflict of, at one end of the spectrum, you've got people who are just desperate to get a roof over their head. And then you've got people who see the real estate market as a place to generate revenue.
Yeah, that's right. For some people, it's a complete cash cow. Absolutely. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that gets quite complex around the way it's taxed in New Zealand. There's all sorts of reasons for that. But you're right. It's becoming more and more apparent that it's a binary thing. There's the haves and the have-nots.
So given that all of that conversation tends to come back to affordability, how does Passive House fit into that, when I suspect that by making walls thicker and adding more layers, your houses aren't going to be any cheaper to build than a code compliant one? Yeah,
you did right. So the capital cost is always going to be higher to build a passive house or something like a passive house. But it's really, one of the problems we have here is that people only consider the capital cost of constructing a building when they look at how much it costs. They don't consider the running costs and costs of ownership. And it's pretty clear, as soon as especially when you get to the colder parts of New Zealand, that to build and own and operate a passive house is generally cheaper or the same cost as to build a code minimum house when you're taking into account energy costs. So a client of ours that we did, so it was New Zealand's first certified passive house plus, we did some years ago now. And he was a banker and he loved the numbers. So he ran a whole bunch of numbers, and it cost around about 8%, an increase of around about 8% in capital build cost compared to the same design built to code minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And he calculated that the increase, and he borrowed the extra 50 grand, and he calculated that the additional cost to pay the mortgage and run the house in the first year, it cost him an additional $23. And
wow.
Every year thereafter, it saved him money.
Wow, that's amazing. So because that 8% could be quite a scary number, but when
Correct.
you look at what you really need to look at is the cost to service that extra 8% and
Correct.
the benefits of the extra money you would have left over from not having to pay as much heating and running costs.
Exactly. Yeah, if I've got a $50 a month energy bill, then there's a bunch of spare cash there to put onto my increased mortgage.
Yeah. That's a great and who better than a banker to figure all that out?
Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, where can people find you and have a look at what you've been up to?
Yeah, sure. Just head to our website. There's a bunch of images on our website of the work we've been doing. So just www.theca.nz, Theca, and you can see our work there, and our contact details are there. You can give us a call and come down for a coffee and a chat. Awesome. So we're just in downtown Christchurch.
Nice spot to be. Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
And that was Glenn Murdoch in Christchurch, and his firm is called Theca, Theca. What do you think, Zach?
I loved it. You got to tell us what nogs and dwangs are, though.
Yeah, well, I always get confused, but in one island in New Zealand, they're dwangs, and the other island, they're nogs. I think they're nogs in the South Island. I could be wrong. They are the horizontal bracing between vertical studs in a timber frame wall, and some very a lot of work's been done on them by some people like Oculus and other structural engineers here, who are very passionate about the fact that most houses don't need them. And there was a really great study done by one of our research associations here from the construction industry, because we have an assumption in our building practice that the content of timber in a wall is around about 15 to 20%, I think, which is quite high. That means that if you put insulation into a wall, that only potentially 80% of it is actual insulation. The rest of it is timber, which is obviously conducts a lot more. So you're reducing some of the insulation. A study was done a couple of years ago and found out that in reality, the average timber content is more like 37%.
Wow.
Which is quite staggering. And I think it's got worse because of more compact design. But also people just putting in 4, 5, 6 studs all slapped together, particularly in corners. And, I've come to realize that structural engineering tends to take precedence over everything else. People don't like it when houses fall down. But I think that's gone a little bit, well, we know that that's gone a bit over the top, that there's just ridiculous amounts of timber, not just vertically, but also horizontally going into structures. And in some instances, I've walked past framed new homes where there's just, I just don't see where they would bother putting insulation in that wall, because there's just so much timber in it, and you almost got like a half solid timber wall. So it is a bit of a problem. The other reason why they put horizontal pieces of wood in there is for fixings of the cladding, which I understand the need to do that, but it doesn't need to happen at the detriment of one of your control layers, one of your really important control layers, which is the thermal control layer. So there's a bit of a campaign for those in the know, like Glenn, to just take out or design them out, to not put in those horizontal bracings in the first place, because they're really not needed, particularly if you use other elements as bracing for the walls. Anyway, that was my long-winded structural engineering 101 experience.
No, that's great. That's that's really helpful. And also for North American listeners, when we hear the term timber frame, I think we sometimes think of like mass timber kind of stuff, bigger.
Yeah, true.
But really, what we're talking about is we're talking about wood frame.
We're not talking wood portal frames, a post and beam. We're talking we call it 90 mil framing. So what's that? 4 inch, 4 by 2. So pretty thin. Timber walls, like sticks turning up on a building site, and the carpenter putting them together, and then plasterboard on the inside and cladding on the outside.
Yeah. And we deal with the same issue with too much wood going into walls, and there's probably a term you guys use there too, is just the advanced framing, right?
Advanced doesn't tend to come into our construction vocabulary too much, I would say.
Well, it may be slow going. It's slow going for us too.
Yeah. And when it does, I kind of cringe, because I look at it and that's not really that advanced. It's just kind of catching up with what you've been doing for a while.
Yeah. So I just to not to put a point on it, but here Energy Star, that US based, says that there are 4 major elements to advanced framing. It typically includes 2x6 wood framing spaced at 24 inches on center. Right. So similar sticks, but spaced more widely, and some or all of the following techniques: single top plates, 2 stud corner junctions, minimal use of jack studs and cripples, and the elimination of redundant studs and unnecessary blocking and bridging. It doesn't mention nogs and dwangs, but I think that's getting at the same stuff.
Well, blocking and bridging sounds
exactly, that's what it is.
Pretty simple. Yeah. So common issues, common realizations as well. Around the place.
Yeah.
Back to Glenn. The interesting thing is that he has also explored other construction methodologies. I don't know if he's done much in the way of SIP panel construction, but he has done some smaller scale prefabrication and panelization of his own. So he has looked at methods of doing building walls, but in a factory at a smaller scale, just to kind of get that going without having a multi-million-dollar factory.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to hear his reflections about prefab and New Zealand as well. I felt like we heard a couple of themes that we're hearing pretty frequently now. There's a convergence here of kind of consensus around things like dealing with overheating. That's a big. It was clearly top of mind for him, and he's using the PHPP as a tool. And so, I mean, a couple of standout stats or numbers was that his commitment to keeping overheating to a maximum of 2%, as opposed to the allowable 10%. And that 10% is just way too high, which makes so much sense. The other one was I was just reflecting on how to stress test essentially designs for overheating, and what is, I think that this is now there's this kind of open question about what's the best temperature to use, basically, depending on where you live, and it was reminded about Monty Paulson's urging of folks to actually go for it and look at the heat dome, these really strange and kind of alarming temperature anomalies that are happening now, and use that as your stress test for buildings, recognizing that those are going to become more common, and we need buildings to be resilient to them even when the power goes out.
Yeah, I guess it's the equivalent of building to a flood event, or designing infrastructure to a storm event of a certain frequency, rather than the average, because average rarely happens in reality. So it's much better to design for a sensible upper limit that's going to really put pressure on things.
Yeah. No, that's a good analogy. It definitely is the same principle.
And it does get pretty warm. I mean, we lived in Christchurch for 8 years, and it's a long way south of us, further away from the equator here in Auckland. So it occasionally snows on the ground. It gets down pretty cold in wintertime. But they have these nor'west winds that can really heat up coming across the Canterbury Plains. And so you get this hot, dry wind, and it's not uncommon to have days when it's a few degrees warmer in Christchurch than it is in Auckland because of this the nor'wester, and they can be pretty uncomfortable because you get the high humidity as well as the heat. And if you've got your buildings optimized to stay warm, and also with that high wind, you don't really want to. Opening windows can be a struggle, because you just get this wind blasting through, and it's just pretty uncomfortable. So thinking about that, the shading and reducing the heat load, particularly in those summer months, is definitely going to be important. And it's really important now. I mean, I have this conversation all the time with people that we're training, going through Homestar and just general learning about building better homes, because our building code is pretty much silent on overheating. So it requires architects, designers, even builders to actually want to do it on their own accord and help educate the market that just because they're getting a brand new home, it doesn't mean it's going to look after them, particularly in the summertime.
Right. And we all know that's just a issue that's going to get more and more.
It's going to get worse.
Severe.
Yeah. And people like Glenn are also leading on using future climate files, which we've also talked about, rather than just using the current assumption it's a bit like the heat dome, rather than just using whatever's in PHPP as the default value for the current summer climate temperatures. Actually tweaking that a little bit and saying, well, what's this region going to look like in 10, 20 years time? Because that's arguably more relevant for a house that you're designing now. And it could well be 2 degrees hotter on average in summertime. So that should be your design point, not what today's temperature has been.
Yeah, it's almost, definitely. And it's almost like the energy demand and energy load. Maybe I've already said this before, but like the climate files give us that average, and it's so important for us to reset that to where we're headed.
Yeah.
And the heat dome is like the spike, so the building needs to be able to handle both.
Yeah. Definitely.
I also was intrigued by this I think all of us are trying to crack the nut of affordability and just people being able to be in houses or be in apartments, be in homes, and his thoughts around challenging this notion that home ownership has to be the answer.
Yeah.
We have in the US our tax, we have huge tax breaks for homeowners. So it's, for decades, we've been basically through policy guiding people toward homeownership. There are some structural things right now that make that, really real. Homeowners do generate wealth. But it is so critical that we figure this out. It's just, it's gotten pretty intense.
Definitely. Well, I'm just pleased that Glenn's still in the game and doing some really good stuff. He's got some great experience and is pretty passionate as well. And another person who's got to that point where if a client comes along and just wants something regular, he's more than happy to move them on and say that's not what we do here.
Yeah. Sticking to his guns is great.
All right. What have we got coming up?
Yeah, well, at Passive House Accelerator Live this Wednesday, so Thursday your time, we have a construction tech episode of the show, and it will be featuring David McCarricker and Melissa Light of MCW Consultants, and they're going to be presenting, and this is a mouthful, but it's beautifully geeky, so I think this is going to be a very popular one. Electrification and energy recovery in the student residence with commercial kitchen typology. So it's all about grappling with energy performance and indoor air quality and ventilation of kitchens and all that great nerdy stuff. So we hope people will join us next week for that. We also, and there are many other things going on in the community. We'll include a link where you can view those things. We're also, FIASCon is coming up next month, the conference of FIAS in Chicago, the last week of October. And we're excited to announce that we're going to be doing special episodes of the Passive House podcast there. And that is going to be underwritten by StoCorp and Zola Windows. So I really want to thank both StoCorp and Zola Windows for making that happen for us. And then we're also working with FIAS Alliance to co-host the after party at FIASCon. So this is the Friday night party. FIAS is the FIAS Alliance and Passive House Accelerator, our after party. And that is being supported and underwritten by 6 sponsors: 475 High Performance Building Supply, Icon Windows and Doors, Innotech Windows and Doors, Partel, Proseco, and Source 2050. And what's cool about this is that initially the price of the ticket for that party was $125, but thanks to this support, it is now $40 per ticket. Awesome. And this is great. It's a great party. There's going to be a live band and great food and drink. So we're excited and really grateful for that support.
But there's more on the Saturday as well, isn't it? Isn't it?
Oh yeah, right. And then next
the party just keeps going.
Yeah, don't overdo it at the party, because on Saturday there are project tours in Chicago. So yeah, it's going to be really fun.
And there's an increasing amount to see on these tours now.
It's true. Yeah.
Very good. All right. And of course, lots of other stuff going on around the place as well. Check out local guides, but also, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to Passive House Accelerator newsletter so that you get all those regular updates into your inbox. Is there anything else we need to mention, Zack?
I think that's good. Yeah. Thanks for the interview. That was great.
Pleasure. We've got some good plans for interviews coming up. So looking forward to getting those and bringing them to you as well. All right. That should do it for this week. Thank you, Zack. And thanks also to the rest of the team at the Accelerator. And we'll be back again next week on Passive House Podcast.